Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. We'll just get right into it. We have here the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions, Ms. Agnes Callamard. She's presented her report yesterday to the Third Committee of the General Assembly. The report, her statement are all available on PaperSmart, which is accessible to all publicly. She's going to make some brief opening remarks, and then we will open the floor for questions. We have a copy of her press release in the back of the room, and you should have received it electronically as well. Ms. Callamard, please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. I presented my report yesterday on the unlawful death of refugees and migrants. I introduced my report by stating that a human rights and humanitarian crisis is unfolding in front of our very eyes, characterized by mass casualties globally, a regime of impunity for perpetrators and high tolerance for its fatalities. Its direct victims are refugees and migrants. In my report to the Third Committee, I highlight a succession of failures on the part of the state, failures to prevent and failures to protect. The tragedy of the arbitrary deprivation of life of refugees and migrants is compounded by the fact that actually we do not know how many of them die every year, how many are killed, how many starve to death, how many die of dehydration, how many die because of negligence or bad treatment. We do not know. The IOM, the International Migration Organization responsible for migration movement and for the so-called Missing Migrants Project, has described this lack of data as the tip of the iceberg, and the loss of life and the fact that we do not know how many lives are lost is an additional story, an additional fatality to the current crisis. The second element of this crisis is the lack of investigations. We're talking about thousands of people who die every year, possibly far higher than that. The investigation into those arbitrary killings or arbitrary deprivation of life can be counted on possibly one hand. So there is a complete and globalized regime of impunity for these mass casualties. The failures to investigate these deaths are themselves additional violations of the right to life. They deepen the invisibility of the violations, hide their victim, and make for ill-informed policy decisions related to migrations, which may result in even further deprivation of life. The mass killings of refugees and migrants constitute an international crime whose banality in the eyes of so many makes its tragedy particularly grave. In the report, I highlight the fact that the greatest threat to refugees and migrants in terms of life are the smugglers and traffickers. There is absolutely no doubt about it, but that states are playing an important role because they fail to respond to those deaths, as I have highlighted, no investigation, but most importantly because the policies that they put in place, the policies of deterrence in particular, put in place globally, are actually grounded on the likelihood that refugees or migrants might die attempting to cross the borders. They are supposed to be deterred from crossing a border because there is an elevated likelihood that they might die. And I really want to insist that when the international community, when member states make this move where mass casualties are directly or indirectly justified in the name of a policy or in the name of politics, I believe that we are perched on the edge of a very deep abyss indeed. Refugees and migrants are lives do not count, seemingly, as much as the lives of many others. And to me, this is an indictment, of course, of the international community inability to protect the most vulnerable, but it is also a further weakening of the international human rights system when the most vulnerable groups of people are not only killed, arbitrarily deprived of life, but that this arbitrary deprivation of life is met with indifference, silence, and possibly condemned. I make a number of recommendations in my report. I believe, of course, that there are very large political questions that need to be discussed and addressed. I am not so naive to think that we are going to be able to make a major shift at that level. My report makes, therefore, a number of practical and policy recommendations that seek to assist member states to at least take some preliminary steps that could decrease the number of people losing their life, and as importantly, that could help their families to find closure. One of the tragedy inside that tragedy is the fact that most migrants who die are never identified. And that means that there are thousands of families in the countries of origin that will never be able to know what has happened to their loved ones. There are practical things that can be done to ensure that at least the connection between the death and the families back home, that connection can be made. And I make a number of practical and policy recommendations to member states and to the international community as intermediary steps towards eventually addressing the bigger questions regarding global policies, global deterrence policies that are directly or indirectly forcing people into harm ways. So, thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that. Are there any questions for the Special Rapporteur? Yes, please go ahead, Matthew.
Sure. Matthew Lee, Intercity Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks a lot for the briefing and for your work. I wanted to, I mean, on this issue of migrants, I wanted to know whether, what you can say about some of the programs or militias that Italy and others in the EU are funding to stop migration, whether you think that some of these, constitute a human rights problem. I also wanted to know, I know that the foreign minister of the Philippines recently met with Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and although the UN refused to give a readout, at least initially, he said that he'd raised your report on the Philippines or visit to the Philippines, that issues concerning you had been raised. They always tell us that the special rapporteurs are entirely independent from the Secretariat. I just wanted to know whether it's your understanding that this was raised to the Secretary General and what you could say about that. And finally, I wanted to know if you're aware of the situation in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon, where recently, in response to what's viewed as a secessionist or desire for a referendum, many protesters have not only been imprisoned, but also killed, some from helicopter gunships. And I think the Secretary General is visiting the President of the country today, but doesn't seem to. I just want to know if you view that as within your mandate in terms of the targeting of people that are protesting, even if you call them secessionists. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so with regard to the first questions about the EU and Italy deal, as my report details, one aspect of the deterrence policy is a policy of extraterritoriality, meaning that governments push their physical borders away from the national borders of the country and call on other states to take the responsibility of preventing refugees and migrants from entering their territory. It is in that context that I analyze the current attempt to make a deal between the European Union and Italy on one hand, the Libyan government on the other. I think we're talking of something to the extent of 46 million euro, which will be geared to provide Libya with the tools to undertake search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean and detain migrants and refugees in a humane fashion and do a range of other related activities. My position, which I have discussed in the report and elsewhere, is that in the current situations, in the current context, I do not find it plausible that Libya is able to prevent or respond to people wanting to leave the country in a human rights protective fashion. I just have everything I have read, every information that has been communicated to me indicate that at the moment, given the current situation in Libya, neither the national authorities nor the groups allied to them are in a position to respond humanly to the situations. We have repeated allegations and some evidence of gross ill treatment of refugees and migrants, including in official detention centers, but also in unofficial detention centers. There are allegations that militias which were not initially involved in the relationship in that deal are now seeking to get involved. That creates far greater tension on the ground. There has been, I have documented examples where the ill-prepared, ill-trained Libyan Coast Guard have shot at and not necessarily responded adequately to boats that they encountered. I have made it clear that I believe that the Italian Coast Guard should be trained. You know, I believe that the institutions in Libya should be strengthened so that they can respond and treat people adequately. But I also think there needs to be guarantees before we rely on Libya to undertake those responsibilities. And at the moment, the guarantees are simply not there, which means that while continuing to supporting Libyan institutions and authorities, we also need to keep migrants and refugees and to offer search and rescue from the standpoint of Europe. It's not, as long as the situation in Libya is not adequate, as long as the support from Europe, the training is not delivering the necessary level of skills to undertake this kind of responsibilities, Europe must keep receiving refugees and migrants through its search and rescue operations. More generally, we need to put in place a system that allows, of course, refugees, asylum seekers to have access to international protections. So it is, in the current context, I believe, and I've said so in my report, there could be allegations or there could be a case made that the European Union or Italy may be aiding and assisting in massive human rights violations. There is customary international law to that effect. It is detailed in my report. I can give you the page if you want. It's page 10 and 11. I am not saying this is the case. I'm just saying we are really edging here, and they should take good notice of that, those responsibilities under customary law. So regarding the meeting of the ambassador of the MFA of the Philippines with the SG, like you, I have received through the press, actually, the Filipino media has reported that my case had been raised by the MFA. I believe as well that there was a press release from the Filipino Minister of Foreign Affairs released about the complaints raised by the minister regarding my behavior and my work as a special rapporteur, which has, so that's how much I know. I do not know how the Secretary General would have responded to those allegations. I hope he would have just said, she's just doing her job.
Do you think it would, just one follow-up, do you think it would have been, as a special rapporteur, is this a case in which it might have been good for the Secretary General to actually issue his own readout of the meeting, since the government, I mean, in the past, the previous Secretary General used to read out all meetings. This one doesn't, but when a government issues that type of a readout saying, we made all these points, we scored these points, do you think the UN itself should say, here's what we said, or?
Well, certainly they could have said, they should have said it to me, as a first step. In view of the report from one of my colleagues, a special rapporteur on freedom of expression, who, as you know, has just issued a report on the transparency of international organizations, I will tend to say that it will be good practice for this kind of information to be released. Otherwise, my response to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, if he had approached me directly, would have been to refer him back to the Code of Conduct, and to the steps I am taking to ensure that I implement my mandate in the most transparent, impartial, and unbiased fashion, that they have not been able to provide with any evidence of misbehavior, except for the fact that I am reported allegations of extrajudicial executions. They have also tended to be very polemical rather than engage with the substance of my allegations. And that, to me, is a problem for me, certainly, but it's a problem for the allegations themselves, which require an active engagement rather than, trying to polemic over them. I forgot the third question.
It was about, I'm not sure if you're aware of the situation.
Oh, yes, Cameroon. Yes, yeah. Absolutely. It's absolutely part of my mandate. The nature and the motivations of the Cameroonian or any other people does not impact on the fact that their right to life must be protected, except in situations, of course, where individuals engaged in violent activities. And even under those circumstances, the response on the part of the state should be proportionate and necessary in terms of the use of force. So the motivations does not impact on whether or not I can respond to their arbitrary deprivation of life. I am fully aware of what's happening in Cameroon. For protocol reasons, I cannot elaborate much, but there is ongoing